Another highlight about this satellite program that I would like to mention, we have a really beautiful movie which was made by Astrida Neymanis, who is a professor at the Sydney University in Australia. And she's professor in the Gender Studies department. And she made this movie in collaboration with scientists and an artist, talking about how we exploit the resources of the sea, how we exploit the sea, and how from the perspective of the sea is also really tired. And we are in a world now, we're talking about climate change and all this, and where we feel really tired and like it's quite heavily loaded. But the sea also speaks for it and say, yeah, it's really tired that all these humans and population are so rely on the sea. So I really encourage you to see it. It's a really beautiful and poetic movie which was made during the Kelp Congress, an event in Norway happening last year. Maybe also good to mention, you can really see how we build the visual and identity and the soundscape of the Algae Summit. So we worked with designers from Studio AATB for the visual identity, and they work in collaboration with robots to do a whole bunch of things. And for this, they collaborated with robots to paint. So teaching the robots how to paint with the different colors, in that case from algae, microalgae pigments. And for the sound, we worked with Riv Schumacher, who is an artist based in Arles, and who recorded different sounds from the algae lab, from materials, water, containers containing algae, and he created this soundscape that we use for the jingle. So all this on the satellite program. And now we move to our last panel talk of the day. So our last panel talk, which is about bioremediation scenarios. So yeah, when we look at algae, the ecology of algae, we understand quite quickly that they can be of great help to absorb CO2, to absorb nutrients. So we are looking now at different projects that work with algae to purify the air of water. We have Henriëtte back here in the studio, artistic director and research director of the Atelier and designer. And Henriëtte will lead this conversation.
Thank you, Jana. So yeah, the sea is tired, and maybe we're all also getting a little bit tired at the end of this Algae Summit, but I think no. We have a really exciting last panel talk where we finally come down to the fundamental stuff. Namely, and it was addressed also in the previous panel by Lucy, bioremediation with algae, but this time in situ, on site, in rural regions, tackling issues as like pollution, but also health, because those are very much connected. And I feel extremely excited to be surrounded by such brain power for the coming 40 minutes. If we would be physically together, I would ask a warm applause for you. Welcome Alexandra Dubini, Professor Brenda Parker, and architect and biodesign researcher Shneel Malik. I will give a sneak preview from your CVs. Alexandra, or Dr. Dubini, you're a researcher at the University of Córdoba in Spain. You graduated from the University of East Anglia in the UK, and you worked 10 years as a permanent research scientist at the National Renewable Energy Laboratory in the USA. And you're now a principal investigator of a both a European and a Spanish-funded project that uses algae bacteria consortia for wastewater bioremediation and their biomass for agronomical valorization. Then Brenda Parker. Dr. Parker is a biochemical engineer and lecturer at University College London. She held a joint appointment on 2 large EU projects. One was to write the UK roadmap for algal technologies in 2013. You have collaborations with the Bartlett School of Architecture and the Slade School of Art on projects related to microalgae. And your current research focuses on the use of algae as a sustainable and scalable industrial biotechnology platform. And then last but not least, Shneel. You are a licensed architect and interdisciplinary biodesign researcher and a PhD researcher. Did you finish this PhD already? I'm not sure, or is it still in progress? It's a research in which you collaborated with Brenda and Marcos Cruz, and you have created Indus, which is a tile-based wall system designed to clean wastewater through bioremediation. And this project also has won the ADO Mini Water Future Design Challenge. Now I will stop. Your CVs are much longer, but I think this is a good introduction to start with. We will first travel virtually to Spain, to Alexandra, and learn more about her work on bioremediation.
Alexandra, we don't hear you. You need to unmute yourself. Yeah.
Yes. Can you hear me now?
Yeah, perfect.
Thank you, everyone, for having me at this Algae Summit. It's a pleasure to start this session. And I am going to talk about today the WABA project, which stands for Water Bioremediation using Algae Bacteria Consortia for Rural Areas. And this project was funded by the AirNetMed scheme, which is a scheme from the 7th Framework Program from the EU. It involves 4 laboratories from 3 different countries, Spain, France, and Morocco. And the idea behind this project was to develop a system that is able to bioremediate wastewater from rural areas using microorganisms. So the first task was to identify microalgae bacteria consortia able to bioremediate and then optimize this process while developing low-cost harvesting techniques to get cleaner water and then more biomass in order to do agronomical valorization, and then finally do an overall study about the impact of this process. So here at the University of Cordoba, we use a green algae called Chlamydomonas, and we were interested in finding a suitable bacterial partner in order to discover a successful consortia. So the idea was that both microorganisms have similar abilities in terms of uptaking compounds, and maybe by combining both, we would be able to doubling their ability to bioremediate contamination. So here we wanted a consortia that is able to grow more, meaning producing more biomass, and consume nitrogen, because nitrogen is one of the main or standard contaminants in wastewater. So typically in our lab, we mix algae and bacterial strain, and then we use different carbon sources to look at their growth and different nitrogen sources to look at nitrogen consumption. Then we look at the consortia and we compared it with control samples such as bacteria only or algae only. And from our screening, we identified a pink bacteria as a suitable partner for our green algae, Chlamydomonas. And you can see here that our consortium is able, after 4 and 11 days, to grow way more. It's more greener than the rest of our control samples. And so we decided to confirm those visual results by measuring chlorophyll. Chlorophyll is a growth parameter, and you can see here in yellow, our consortia is able to increase its chlorophyll by 10 times and its dry weight by 28-fold. So the second step was to look at nitrogen consumption. Is our consortia able to uptake, for example, here, ammonium? And you can see that after 2 days in yellow, our consortia is able to eat or take up everything that is in the media. Similarly, nitrate and nitrite are also uptaken more efficaciously by our consortia than the rest of our control samples. So here we have identified a successful consortia that can grow more and consume nitrogens in synthetic media. So the next step was to test the ability of this consortia in real wastewater. So our partners in France send us wastewater from a rural area, and we tested our consortia. And as you can see here in yellow, the results are a bit disappointing. Sometimes the consortia grew more or grew less. So we decided our media, our wastewater, and you can, knowing that it can boost the bacteria growth. And you can see here in the photo that the consortia is way greener now than the rest of the control samples, and the chlorophyll concentration, so the growth parameter, is improved along the days, as well as the dry weight. You can see here that it's improved by 3 times. So now we have a consortia that works. So the next step was to upscale the growth of this consortia from lab scale to bench to raceways. So the CEA set up 3 100-liter raceway units, and they set up pumps, data logging, pH control. They connected everything so they can control those parameters. And at the same time, developed a biofilm in order to get the algae to bind to this wheel and then mature, so binding more and more until it's able to fall off. So this is a very low-cost harvesting technique, and we are able to accumulate this biomass easily. So the next step was to prepare this biomass and send it for biostimulation experiments. So they froze it, lyophilized it, and sent it to our partner in Morocco at the Maskir Institute. And here the question was, is the biomass of this specific consortia able to stimulate the growth of tomato plants? And you can see that after different experiments, the shoot and root size of our plants was increased. So the consortia, the biomass, has a positive impact and is actually stimulating the growth of those tomato plant growth. So here we have a consortia able to remediate nitrogens from wastewater, and from which the biomass can be used for agronomical valorization. And so the final step was to estimate the potential impact of this system. And here the IPMED in France decided to conduct a survey, and I'm joining the report here because I don't have time to go into details. But basically, we have to do further experimentation. And of course, we want to evaluate those performance, technical and economical, at larger scale. So that will be the future of this project and the next step. So right now, we are working on a new consortia and testing new wastewater, so that we perhaps we can develop a more general system that can be applied to different needs. And with that, I will thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Alexandra. I hear myself double. It's very impressive to see these results. In the end, you say, like in other situations, like with other consortium or other needs could be could be addressed with this technology. I was wondering what opportunities do you see apart from using the biomass as fertilizer?
So the biomass can be used, of course, for different things. So one would be biogas. Here in Spain, we are specialized in hydrogen production also. So that would be one avenue. And of course, it can be used for feed. This would be the next thing that we are interested in. In fact, algae biomass can be used for many things. So it's a great avenue.
But if you use it for animal food, because that is what you mean with feed, right?
Yes.
Yeah. Then the next question would be, but then how to not offer companies an excuse for polluting? Like we solve problems, or your technology is solving problems of the dairy or meat industry. Can you give your opinion on that?
I think so. You mean carry on the meat industry, anyways? Even so, the way I see it is that we're gonna have to perhaps start developing a parallel way using algae to compensate for meat. But in the meantime, we cannot remove all the meat, and I'm sure many people still want to eat meat. But if we can remediate some aspects of the contamination of that industry, and in the meantime develop a new one that is only algae-based, for example, or plant-based, I think we are going in the right direction.
Yeah, so slowly the algae take over the whole cycle. That's that we love to hear on an algae summit. Do you have questions, Johanna?
I just would like to ask a short question. So, like, of course, cost is important. You say it, and you're trying to work on a low-cost, systems. Do you also think this solution you're working on could be adapted for domestic use? So at the scale of one house, or would it be too expensive still for at this scale?
The system is really for rural areas, and actually was developed for Mediterranean areas, meaning they don't have much means in terms economical means, and so that would be that could be a cheap and easy option. The next step would be to plug those systems a little bit different, but to directly to wastewater treatment plants that we have, for example, in Europe, or in France, or in Spain. But that will be a bit different, more automatized, and at bigger scale, let's say. So I don't know if I'm answering your question, but
okay,
that we have,
I think so. I think maybe we go to the to the presentation of Shneel and Brenda, and we talk later all together on this. Shneel and Brenda, are you there? Yeah. We go to your presentation.
Right. Does it all look okay?
Yeah.
Amazing. Thank you so much, firstly, for inviting me and Brenda to be a part of this brilliant summit. We're actually, Brenda's in London and I'm in India, so time differences are clearly all counted in. So me and Brenda are a part of the Biointegrated Design Lab, as we were correctly introduced. I'm Brenda's PhD student, and I've been working under her for the last few years, where we're trying to understand how we can use design and tools in architecture to integrate the technology of the sciences, and that's exactly what we're here to talk to you about today. I'll let Brenda take it from here.
Thanks, Shneel. So as I mentioned, I'm Brenda. I'm a biochemical engineer, and this project is really a great example of how we work together with architects. to really probe and explore some issues within our built environment. So maybe to firstly sort of introduce some of the kind of concepts that we're looking at today. So we really want to think about how do we embed biology within architecture? How do we work with living systems? And how do we scale it up? And that's the kind of interesting, interconnected nature of the work that we do. And it's really important to kind of state that this project is really working from the ground up, trying to re-examine, and it's fantastic to follow Jan and the BIQ houses. This was certainly a huge influence on the way we were thinking about working with algae in the built environment and what it means to work with aqueous systems. So as inspiration, we began to look to the biomedical field, for instance, and look at places where cell mobilization has already happened. Of course, it's been done in industrial biotechnology, but here you see the work of Anja Lode's group, which again was very influential on what we had been thinking about, which is how can we use additive manufacturing tools? How can we explore different geometries? And this work, which was conducted on quite small scale, embedded algae within a printable matrix. And it was really this that we decided to use as a bit of a departure point for some of our subsequent explorations on scaling up photosynthetic membranes. So we did some work and some research into biocompatible materials, trying to understand some of the really fundamental engineering principles as well around gas and mass transfer, what it means to print with a viscous material. And yeah, so we arrived at a point where we began to look at kind of methods of manufacturing as well.
So what was interesting for an architect's perspective was obviously there is this material that everybody in the biomedical field was exploring, and these structures were 3D printed on an extremely small scale, but then they were integrated into our body and they would act in harmony with, you know, the host environment. And that really intrigued me as an architect. So we started to perform our own material experiments to understand the material property of, you know, a hydrogel, a completely water-based material that is extremely viscous. And we know that anything that is viscous and has high quantity of water is a gel. And you can't really design anything, or you can't make larger scale objects. But then we started to use the technique of additive manufacturing or 3D printing, where layer by layer we started to deposit fibers. And what we did was that with each fiber we deposited, we started to change the percentage of water within the material. So where we needed higher structural stability, which is very important for an architectural scale and for us to start scaling up these structures from super nanometers and millimeters into centimeters and meters. With each layer, the bottommost layers would have low percentage of water, and their photosynthetic property or their compatibility with the microalgae would be less. And the topmost layers, or with each layer, we started to add the percentage of water, fine-tuning fine-tuning the hierarchical deposition, just like a lot of the other materials that we see surround us in nature. And instead of a small desktop 3D printer, we built our very own sort of extrusion system, and we put it on a robotic arm so that we can actually scale this up. So what you see here is the 3 different materials with 3 different water percentages and microalgae. And the design is very important here, because what do we want these membranes to look like, especially in terms of their functionality? And therefore, we started to computationally generate these fibrous-like structures so that the surface area to volume ratio within the thickness of the membrane was optimized to allow for the growth of the microalgae, while still retaining the structural stability of the membranes. So what you see here are very initial additive manufactured or robotically extruded photosynthetic membranes. And these panels are 1 meter long, and they were exhibited at the Biotallinn Biennale. and I'll give it back to Brenda from here.
Yeah, sure. So around about this time, when we were working on the photosynthetic membranes, we were wondering, how do we link this with ideas of bioremediation? And this is something that I've been working on for quite some time, around sort of nitrate uptake and more recently sort of heavy metals as well. And as part of a fellowship that I had from the Winston Churchill Memorial Trust, I spent a number of months visiting sites, trying to understand why bioremediation is so heavily researched but so rarely implemented. And really, I believe quite strongly that design and really thinking about being user-centered as well as taking into account a lot of other social factors is really the missing link. So as we began the Indus project, we had the opportunity to go out to India, to Kolkata, and we visited a number of artisan manufacturers, including a small cooperative that made bangles. So this is really a classic kind of case study, if you like, that we touch back on many times when we were designing on Indus, thinking about the size, the scale, the resources that are available to people who work in these sites, and the kind of volumes of wastewater that are generated, and the challenges that these guys face as they work in a decentralized way. But they want to protect their livelihoods, but yet there are other pressures on them to start to meet regulations for wastewater treatment. So this is really, this sort of giant leap of many months, but this is the next design that we had come up with, which is really the beginnings of the Indus project. And we took the idea of the immobilization of the cells, and rather than thinking about kind of 3D printing or robotic extrusion as a way of, I could send a file to you and you can print it where you are, we thought about maybe constructing a scaffold for the immobilized cells to be able to, again, explore a different type of geometries, but also to embed this within the kind of built environment of an artisan manufacturing site.
So we designed these vein-like ceramic scaffolds that are now embedded with the hydrogel containing the microalgae layered within the vein-like structures. It was super interesting for me to understand or to get to know where is all this wastewater coming from, and going into these artisans and looking at their daily activities and their infrastructure. From an architect's point of view, you can start to think, how can you design something that not just uplifts their infrastructure and their environment, but also is able to perform a function, in this case, contribute to cleaning the polluted water and potentially even reusing it within their system. So therefore, this sort of scaffolds or tiles that can be tessellated into a vertical wall, depending on the space available within the artisans. So either it is really big, where it works for a community, or it's small, exclusive to one unit. The idea is that you can introduce the water at the top of the wall. The water enters the system, running onto the branch channels, allowing the microalgae present within this material to absorb the pollutants present in the wastewater. We can recycle or recirculate the water over the wall depending on how many contaminants, the quantity of the contaminants present in the wastewater, leaving behind a potentially bucket of cleaner water, which the artisans could reuse. So the idea is that how can you decentralize wastewater treatment and make such a technology available to the artisans so that they can integrate this within their daily activities. And this is a very important element where the scaffolds are actually constructed using locally available materials, so that they can do this by themselves. And our very first scaled-up demonstrator was exhibited last September at the London Design Festival, where we had demonstrated the entire working principle. It was the first time we assembled all the tessellated the tiles. We had the water circulating. And that was the first iteration of the Indus design.
Yeah, so what is probably also happening in parallel here is some of our research around uptake of heavy metals, measuring things like residence time and the capacity and the loading. So one thing we realized is that we wanted to be able to slow down the passage of water over the surface of the wall. So for Indus 2.0, what we decided to do was explore different kind of computational geometries to look at the role of form, not just in the aesthetics of the wall. It is something that we're also incredibly interested in, is the idea of probing the form and challenging perhaps some of the aesthetics around algae in the built environment, but to also use this as an opportunity to look at how we could improve performance through geometry. And again, this is something that I feel is really exciting as an area for me, is to look at, this is a really alternative way of doing this than had this just been a straightforward engineering project. We would have probably built a tank or some kind of very standardized vessel. Whereas in this case, we're really looking at a more elegant, more sophisticated way of trying to control the flow of water over a surface and optimize that surface area to volume ratio. So here is the next version of Indus, which is on display at the moment at Beazley Designs of the Year at the Design Museum in London. So yeah, maybe just to kind of finish off, really when it comes to the idea of bioremediation, I don't see this as anything that can be accomplished purely by scientists or designers or anyone alone. This is inherently collaborative activity, but it also touches on the idea of the circular economy, prolonging the lifespan of things that have been created in a man-made sense and upgrading them. So I guess this is really the vision of what we have for Indus, is that it is not only kind of means of capturing pollutants, but hopefully a step towards recovering, recycling and upgrading nutrients or metals within our environment.
And I would just probably add an end to that the context is very, very important. So we don't really imagine the replication of the same wall everywhere. But the idea is to understand the principle and understand the context biologically and environmentally, that then feeds into how the next iteration of the wall or even something more volumetric and landscape-like would become. And that's how sort of, a designer and a biochemical engineer, I think that's, I think these are the kind of projects that can come forth. And this is just the beginning of the journey for Indus and many such bioremediation projects at BioID. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you, ladies, for the passionate talk. I'm very impressed.
Yeah, and it sounds you have a really great relationship, and we can feel it.
We have a lot of fun, which I think is important when you're dealing with such serious subjects.
But I think it's not only like design and science coming together, but really also local context, rural local context, plus like a very polluting global fashion and dyeing industry. So this is really bringing a lot together. And I was wondering, how did the people react in the village in India, like on this idea and on the design? And did you test run there, like how to make people familiar with this bioremediation thinking?
Yeah, so I think that is the next step for us. We are super excited to go into the field and do these experiments and also conduct community engagement workshops to understand, for instance, the artisan workers a bit better, but also be able to teach how they can construct this wall and how they could maintain it, for instance. So that is a part of our vision.
And then we will get Indus 3.0.
Yeah, but I think actually what's really important to unpack is the term demonstrator that Shneel was using. And that's really what the London Design Festival was. It was, before we even get to stage of a prototype, there's no real point, we weren't doing this specifically to test the performativity, in the bioremediation sense. Only alone. The London Design Festival also gave us an opportunity to see how people experience this. What are the questions that people ask? And I think the idea of wastewater treatment is often hidden in our cities. I mean, certainly I wouldn't even know where my wastewater goes, whereas the idea of Indus is to really kind of invert that relationship with water, to make it very visible, to make this a source of pride, and for people to feel committed to it. So I feel like, yeah, the next stage is a prototype. There's a lot of work still to do before that happens.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, I think that's a very important point, and I was wondering how Alexandra, if you would react on that, because I mean, without the design aspect, I mean, this question of making the water treatment visible, I think you're also dealing with that, and how and you're starting now implementing this. Solutions in Spain. So, are you also confronting with reaction from people, or is it too early at the moment, or and are you trying to make that visible? I mean, on the cultural side, what's your feedback on that from the field?
Issue here is that not everyone is on board with wastewater treatment using algae. So first you have to convince the industry. And depending on where they are, how big they are, they will be willing to work with you, or at least investigate the properties of algae with their wastewater. I think the second issue is also the quantity of wastewater that we are able to treat. So, for example, I don't know with your project, with the tiles, how much wastewater can you treat through that? So that is an issue, because usually wastewater treatment plants are very big. So it's asking a big effort from the company to actually install a new system, maybe using algae or consortia algae bacteria, and then see what are the effects.
Yeah,
so,
because the technology that you... Sorry to interrupt you, but the technology, Alexandra, that you suggest is really complementary to, or kind of attached to, the existing wastewater treatment plant, whereas I think the systems that Brenda and Shneel advocate are also complementary, but like separated and smaller scale, right?
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah, and that's a really interesting point. So, one thing I remember when I went to Campor is actually a lot of their biological wastewater treatment is deactivated by the amount of contaminants and heavy metals that are going into the system. So perhaps a pre-treatment, that sort of a lot of the thinking comes from some of the things we've been able to observe. But certainly scaling is a challenge, and thinking also about, acceptance. It is, I think algae is still seen as quite a high risk set of technologies. This brings into a whole separate discussion about the mastery of man over nature, which I think, I don't know if we want to get into today, but we still haven't been able to tame algae. And I think that's something that Lucy had mentioned as well. We work with a number of different strains, not very many in the context of biodiversity, but we're still at a very nascent level of understanding how they work.
Yes, so you touched upon it already a bit before, but then the evaluation systems or the measuring tools that you offer also, I think, to the local community become quite important. Can you say something about that, Brenda?
Yeah, I was going to actually say to Shneel. So the idea of measurement is a really important one in bioremediation systems, and certainly when you think about something that might be deployed in, kind of probably an unconventional, certainly not in a wastewater treatment system where you have monitoring and measurement. And this is really one of the things that we've been kind of coming back to, is about the lifespan of Indus and what that means. I don't know, Shneel, maybe you want to say something about, how we've been kind of thinking about this in terms of its circularity.
Yeah, so I think there are different elements to this. The first is that there is definitely a saturation limit within the material itself when it's applied on the tiles. In the most frugal way, we imagine that once the saturation level is reached, it sort of starts to change color visibly. So it sort of acts like a sensor in itself, but again, this needs to be tested in the field, in the lab, way more thoroughly. exactly what Alexandra was mentioning, that the contaminants and the quantity of contaminants and how many contaminants are found in the water samples are very different, and they're still unchecked. I think there was a recent report in September 2020 in the UK itself that said that none of the rivers actually reached a good quality sort of a check, because the water quality hasn't been assessed and monitored over so many years. So just being able to understand that is a challenge in itself. But we, in terms of the design, we've sort of been brainstorming and creating different narratives of how the system could be maintained, and can it be designed for the locals themselves to maintain it. So there was also this conversation within the circular economy diagram that actually Jan showed in his presentation, where we, in an ideal scenario, would want to find a way of even extracting the heavy metals that are trapped in the material, and then creating a relationship, bringing back those heavy metals to create other products, but then creating a relationship between the local artisans and the people that are benefiting from this heavy metal, so that they can incentivize each other for the artisans to continue to maintain the system.
Yeah.
And then, I think, Brenda.
No, it's just an example of every time we meet a challenge like this, it's an opportunity for a kind of technical innovation. So when we first started working on the photosynthetic membranes, we had to work out how do we extrude something bigger than a syringe full of material. And that led us to work with a whole team of other people at the Bartlett and engineering to come up with this robotic extrusion system. And that opened up a whole set of possibilities around, the geometries, forms and scales that this could take, and, which organisms are embedded, etc. So I really think there are lots of unknowns, but they start to pose interesting questions that we then begin to work collaboratively with other people to try and solve. So I think that's the value of a demonstrator project, is that it takes the pressure off. You don't have to necessarily guarantee its performance, but what you can use it as a tool to explore and invite collaboration with other people who may have good ideas about how to kind of add or change the form of it.
I think that's a very interesting point, because then you can start thinking of not just designing to replace something that's existing, instead of designing to disrupt the norm and creating something new, because there's no fun in just replacing the body of a package and that's it, right? It's fun to redesign the package and the way you consume the product. So.
It makes me think of the discussion that I had before also with Alexandra, talking about how the biomass also could, in case it's, for instance, not suitable as fertilizer, because, the biomass varies also. But, for instance, in Cordoba, how it could be related to the local crafts there. Like you have, for instance, the cuir de Cordoue, like embossed leather. It's Cordoba is famous for that, and we were fantasizing how this would could relate to the biomass that is a product of this bioremediation process. I wanted to ask something else to Alexandra. What was it? Let me see. Yeah, I was wondering, could you say something about the costs of bioremediation systems compared to pump and treat ones?
I don't have.
No,
I don't have data about this, because since we were not able to do an very bigger upscale, and we don't have data that we could analyze, for a long period of time. So this would be in the future something that we would love to do, but we don't have an economical analysis right now.
Yeah.
It's very interesting that a lot of the justifications for bioremediation have to come down to some kind of value system. And that sort of speaks as well about the way we think about natural capital. you know, what is the value of clean water? Oh, I have to monetize it by being able to make something useful out of my biomass. And I feel like that's a challenge put on us, maybe prematurely, within this kind of research, where we're constantly trying to look at how the economics add up, but when actually what you're giving back is a substance that nobody can do without. So it's a fascinating field to work in, because there's a lot of competing pressures on people to be able to demonstrate multiple things at the same time, which is not easy to do.
Yeah. So what did? Oh yes, Alexandra. Yes.
No, I wanted to add that it's totally correct. The pressure that we have about how much it costs and how can we implement it quickly, efficiently. But I think the way to sell that is that we have a circular economy that can be based on algae, because algae capture CO2, grow, produce biomass, and then this biomass can be used, and this algae, while living, can bioremediate. So we have many things that can be done with just one algae. And so maybe the cost is not so down to how much right now the liter of wastewater will cost if we use algae. Is what can we do with algae in general as a circular economy, bioeconomy?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So what you say also is that to upscale and to implement, like, the technology is there. Of course, financial support is needed, but mainly it's a kind of change of mindset also that is needed.
Yes. Yeah.
Yeah.
Does it also have to do, I'll just probably add a question, comment, I don't know what it is. Does it also have to do with the expectations of what you want the system to perform, right? Because it's often maybe funny. I've had just one or two conversations where someone says, this is my problem. Do you think you can build this wall and solve it? I'm like, I'm not really sure, because the wall is designed for a particular context and the microalgae will perform in the same way. Your problem, we understand that this is an existing condition and a problem, but you can't just have the system, installed there. So the kind of expectations also maybe need to be changed. And that's when systemic thinking starts to feed in, that it's not just do you necessarily need to design for the technology and the instruments that are already available? Or do you also need to rethink somehow the tools that you need in order to get to the system to perform, scale up, get into the field and do something, right? And I think that's where we often block ourselves, because we say, I don't know, it would be nice to do this, but I don't think I have the tools. And, so that's why even we would always see the beads that were immobilized, which are very common. And we very naively started to sort of create those beads, but then we couldn't scale up. Those beads wouldn't grow. They wouldn't grow by themselves. So that's how we started to extrude these fibers and then started to immobilize the fibers instead of the otherwise beads. So we had to then rethink how the robot or an additive manufacturing system could be designed. So it's sort of, a bit of fabrication, tooling, designing, and all of this sort of comes back and forth. So it's not that easy.
Shneel, I hear lots of work to be done, but it has to be done, and it will be done. We have to make an end to this conversation. Thank you. It was wonderful. And I can't wait to collaborate with you.
It was fantastic. Thank you. I'm sitting here with my algae book from LUMA. So thank you very much for sending this in the post.
No, glad that you like it. Yeah, we have a few. Then I will just present it afterwards. And thank you. I would like to thank you as well. And I think what we discussed at the end of the panel nicely connect to the first panel talk we had at the beginning of the day. It was around blue economy and circular economy, and this where we emphasize that the need to think about value and indeed not to be forced always to think about economic feasibility, but where do we place the value and how can we change this perspective? And yeah, this is not an easy task, and we need to work together on that, like with scientists, with designers, with engineers, but also with philosophers, lawyers, etc. Yeah, try to make this switch. So thank you so much, and we need to end it here, and we stay in touch and see you soon.